All right. Well, I'm really happy to be here today with Tatsuki Hakoyama, Taz. He will be talking to us a little bit today. We got to know Taz because he worked as the Emerging Artists of Color mentor for 2022 and did a fantastic job working with Elisha. And he also taught several classes while he was working as a mentor here. And he has an exhibit coming up with ACW Lake-Nuveen, which we're super excited about. That exhibit will be January 27th through March 11th. And the title of that exhibit is Human Nature. Taz, thanks for joining us today. I do have your bio here that I lifted from your website, and I can read it off, but I feel like it would be much more interesting if you told us a little bit about yourself, about your background, who you are as an artist and as a person.
Okay. Hi, everyone, and thanks for having me here. So I am a artist based in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I got my bachelor's from Central Michigan University and my master's from Kendall College of Art and Design. And I actually currently teach at Kendall College of Art and Design. Me as a person, I was born in Japan. I was raised in Japan until the age of 8, 7, 8, one of those ages. And then my family moved to a small island country of Samoa in the middle of the South Pacific. And I lived there for 4 years before moving to the United States. So I experienced a lot of different cultures growing up. And now I'm in Grand Rapids, surrounded by snow. Well, what would be snow in usual winter, probably. And a lot of my work does deal with or at least influenced by my own experiences. And a lot of the works that will be in the show at our ACWL is going to hopefully make sense to you after listening to me talk a little bit and after this interview.
Cool. Well, I actually really want to ask you about the show. I'm going to read a little bit that you sent us about the show, which is called Human Nature. It's human/nature. So Human Nature is a collection of pieces from various bodies of work. Some of these works focus on a figure as the subject, while others focus on landscape. However, the underlying theme is the relationship that we as humans have with nature. So I found that title really intriguing, and also your description of it really intriguing. I wondered, can you tell me how you chose that title for it, what it means to you?
Yeah. So like I mentioned, I grew up in different, places. But in Japan, I grew up in a small village outside of a city, and it was surrounded by a bunch of trees and mountains. And in a Pacific Island country, obviously, you can think of typical calendar, like tropical island calendar kind of scenery, like surrounding you. So I grew up surrounded by nature a lot, but more than that, I was growing once I started to grow up more. I started thinking more about how our environment and communities impact the way we see things, how we act, what creates culture, and those kind of things. And a lot of my figurative works reflect on how we interact with our surroundings, and what changes and what impacts the way we think. So with the figurative works, landscape becomes kind of like a backdrop a lot in my work. And if I'm not working with figurative works, oftentimes I still kind of get drawn to creating landscapes. It's a way for me to just kind of zone out and just relax almost without having to think as much. And it is kind of that therapeutic process for me in a way. And I also feel that way when I am in out in nature as well. Although sometimes you get busy and you don't get as much time to really do that, especially when making artworks takes a long time. But nature, natural elements are always in one way or another included in my paintings. And I thought the title of human/nature worked well because I do reflect on those things throughout, but also because I'm always looking into this idea of human behaviors, that human nature aspect of things, in how we behave. So I thought it worked on multiple levels in that way of just using landscape as well as the idea of human nature as our tendencies to see things the way we do based on our surroundings.
Very cool. Are you an outdoorsy person? Do you spend a lot of time outside?
I used to a lot more. I used to skateboard a lot, so I was always out, at skate parks and stuff, and just being outdoors. And when I was in Samoa, I used to go fishing all the time and that kind of stuff. I mean, when I was in Japan, like the place I lived was essentially in the middle of nowhere, so it's probably more. It could be more camping like than a lot of like campgrounds in Michigan, almost level probably. Um, so I do enjoy the outdoors. It is a lot harder to find time. When you have a lot of work and you have to get paintings done. I do enjoy like plein air paintings here and there, but um, it's really becomes more about time management more than others. I feel like.
Yeah, everyone I feel like has similar feelings. It's always can be hard to get that time. Cool. You mentioned figurative allegory, and you've also discussed magical realism in your work and on your website and in some of the statements about your work. Why are you drawn to these modes of expression, to figurative allegory and magical realism?
So one of the reasons that I'm drawn to like magical realist approach is because uh, well, let's talk a little bit about like the differences between like more the surrealist approach and magical realist approach. So like I also enjoy surrealist painters as well. Salvador Dali is probably the most famous among all of them, because they do start to do a lot of like visually interesting things that gives like a sense of story with what they're creating. But sometimes the realist approach, it's so out there that it's harder to kind of ground the work into a real world because it's purely about that dream state and like the subconscious. With magical realism, it gives it a little more like there's something that's different and odd about it, but it still roots the image to more of that real life like physics almost. And I like to do that kind of stuff so that the works have a little more you know visually interesting things happening where it's like not just a purely representational image, but it also keeps the image to reflect on the real world that in which we exist rather than just making it into like that's just a dream world kind of approach, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. So it's, I mean, it sounds like it sort of helps anchor
Yeah,
your paintings in the real world,
yeah,
which is one of the things that I really love. I love that combination of something that feels, yeah, I guess surreal or dreamlike, but also feels realistic, especially in the characters that are featured. Very cool. In some of your pieces, your figures are wearing or holding up masks. The piece behind you has a
yeah.
character with a mask on. For you, what's the significance of the mask imagery?
So there's a couple of different factors that impact, well, that influence my decision to do a lot more of those. And one is that once I start to kind of hide the face, it does make it a lot less about individual and more so like a person in general, as opposed to it's about this one person. Especially since like I tend to use a lot of like either myself or my wife as the model because of accessibility ish, things. We're always here, so it's easier to use as reference. But once you start to have a lot more, like a lot of paintings that are that you use as repetitive models, it starts to kind of interfere with people looking at the work and seeing it more as autobiographical or just looking at them as, oh, this painting is about this specific person. And I do want to try to eliminate that kind of separation between how people see and interpret the work. So masks are a good way of kind of creating that and I try to make it so it seems natural enough so it doesn't seem too forced, or at least I try to. I don't know if it works that way, but I try. So that it feels like, it makes sense within the space, but also like try to eliminate that individual characteristic so that people can see themselves in the painting a little bit easier, I feel like.
Very cool.
And
Sorry, go ahead.
and like in the past I've also created works that are a lot more autobiographical or like a lot more personal, and with those ones I was less I used masks less. I just like painted myself a lot more because again it was autobiographical. So it just depends on what kind of work I'm doing and what I'm trying to communicate and how I want people to view the work.
Very cool. So I know in college you initially studied architecture. Is that correct? I think you mentioned that the last time we spoke.
Yeah, I was planning. At first, I was in the math program as like a pre-architecture like kind of path. So technically, I think I was like a math major for the first couple of years before, like in the hopes that I would transfer to like an architecture program.
What made you decide to choose to go down an artistic path rather than going into, architecture or something math related?
Um, I would say the reason is because I did start taking drawing classes as a prerequisite or like to transfer to like more of the the architecture and engineering type process. But I really enjoyed the more creative freedom that the artistic path has. It's more about expressing yourself a lot more than the logistics of things. And I've always enjoyed doing creative things. So it's just a matter of like what do I do? What would I want to do with my life, kind of thing.
Cool. And did your experience with architecture and math affect your work in any way? Either do the way it looks or the way you approach it?
Um, I don't think that specifically impacts it too much, but I do use a fair amount of like perspective knowledge into my work, especially my previous body of work. Some of them creates this trompe l'oeil effect, like that makes it feel like the painting is coming out almost at you. And to do that, I am using a lot of mechanical perspective system, which is similar to what drafting kind of approaches, where it's creating sense of space using more mathematical approach. So I do incorporate that here and there, but it's not as direct as it could be, I guess, in that way.
Cool. Your Instagram bio says you're an artist, educator, musician, and metalhead. And on your Instagram, you have some wonderful clips of you playing multiple instruments. Yeah, very cool. Does your musical work inspire your visual art at all?
Um, a little bit in a way. I mean, I am a proud metalhead. I listen to a lot of European symphonic power metals, like folk metal bands a lot. Um, and I think it's not as direct, but they do influence like my creative approaches a lot. Like their lyrics and stuff tends to be a lot more poetic than a lot more, probably more compared to a lot of like pop music that you would hear. They do have a lot of songs that are that reflect on like human interaction with nature and stuff, as well as like underlying theme. Um, and in a more direct way, like I actually do reflect on some of the titles that I have for my works are either reflecting or are taken from some of the metal songs that aren't really directly related, but some of them are inspired by some of the metal lyrics and like metal songs that I have. Um, so in that way, it is impacted a little bit here and
Cool. I don't know how many metalheads that we have who will be watching this, but we might have some. And so I wonder, what metal music do you recommend? Are you listening to anything right now that you just are really
there.
loving?
Well, that's a tough one. I could go on. Like I feel like I could do a whole 1 hour interview just with the metal songs. But I would like to say that like a lot of the stuff that I listen to are probably a little less. Um, I mean, I think in the U.S. there is this tendency for people to think that metal music is all about like screaming and death metal kind of thing, or like more the thrash metal like Metallica and that kind of stuff. Like Megadeth kind of approach. But there are a lot of variety of metal bands out there that are a lot easier to get into. Um, I would say one of my favorites is Nightwish, which is symphonic metal band from Finland. Um, some of their songs are very easy to get into. It's kind of like film score, but with a lot of like a little more heavier drums and guitar kind of things. Um, and I've been listening to a little bit more of this band called Serenity, which I don't remember exactly which country they're from, but they do a lot of like a lot of their songs are inspired by like history. So like the front person, the singer is actually he has I believe a master's and PhD in like geography and history and stuff. And he uses a lot of like historical content. So they have songs about Henry VIII called Legacy of Tudors. They have other songs, that reflect that are inspired by artists like Albert Durr and stuff like that. So there are some of those things that, content-wise, that can be interesting to me as an artist as well.
Cool. Yeah, I think on your site I saw a hashtag folk metal, and that was the first time I'd ever heard that term, and I thought it was really cool. And it's always exciting to discover some new genres. So very neat. You're also a teacher. You're an educator, and I'm wondering does teaching inform your artistic practices, and if so, how does it?
It definitely does. I mean, I feel like everyone says this, but teaching is really a great way to learn yourself. And I feel like since I started teaching, it was once I started teaching that I really understood the significance of the foundations, like things like design principles and just the drawing fundamentals. Like it's stuff that when I was a student, I knew that they like everyone tells you it's important, but I was, it's easy to kind of just brush it off to the side and like, yeah, we know that kind of thing. And then once I started teaching, I'm like, oh, I really need to get back into the basics and really make sure that it's like that I'm always thinking about it in the process. Um, and since I do work a lot more in a representational way, like when you work in a more representational way, there is to a certain extent like a right or wrong. If you're doing a figure that is supposed to look realistic and anatomy and proportion is off, that's off. And there's stuff like that where it's like if I'm teaching about these classes, I need to make sure my work isn't like completely off with proportions, stuff like that. So like it keeps me having to double check more than I used to make sure like I'm keeping these things, in check really. Um, so I need to make sure to lead by example, right? As a teacher, like I feel like I gotta always try to. I mean, I'm always still learning. I'm always trying to improve, and I'm always learning. But I need to at least to a certain extent show that my students that to a certain extent I've been doing this a while and I understand some of the basic concepts at least.
Yeah, I've done some teaching, and you always have a group of people there to keep you honest. If you're not, following the rules or doing something right, usually someone will point it out. So that's very cool. So did you have any influential teachers for you growing up, either in art school or just growing up, and anyone who affected your artwork or your teaching practices?
Um, I mean, I've had a lot of good teachers, but one of the professors that I think that influences my work the most is one of my professors from undergrad at CMU. Um, she works with the figurative stuff, with also like a lot of nature surrounding the figures. So like it's aesthetically speaking, like it's very similar to what the kind of stuff that I'm interested in. So I would say like stylistically, I'm probably most influenced by her. Um, but I mean, in a way, like I think as artists, we're always influenced by everything surrounding us. It's just a matter of how we dilute them into our own. It is true that nothing that we create is truly original. We are just essentially just mixing everything into one and letting it out of our own, like as our own mix of things, right? So yeah, it's hard to say like who's influenced me the most, kind of things. But yeah.
Um, the teacher that you mentioned,
Uh,
what was her name?
Shelly Newman Stevens. So she also runs Golden Apple Artist Residency in Maine. And yeah, I think Golden Apple Studios, maybe. If you search that on Google, you would be able to see a lot of her work.
Very cool. Um, Earlier, you talked a little bit about surrealism. You mentioned Dali, and sort of a little bit about the way it's affected you. What are some of your artistic influences? Any particular artists who have had a big impact on you?
I would say probably my favorite is Rene Magritte. He's also a pretty famous usually considered surrealist artist, but his work is usually a lot more stylistically closer to like that magical realist approach where like it's definitely surreal, but it's usually not nearly as much like out there as some of the other surrealist work. Um, and his stuff is probably one of the most influential thing for me. But there's also other artists that I really enjoy. There's a Japanese artist called Tetsuya Ishida, and his work is very like critical of the Japanese society, and like he uses a lot of figures to reflect on like the societal impact on people and that kind of stuff. Or at least that's what I take from his work. Um, I'm also interested in and inspired by some of the magical realist painters from the 1960s. George Tucker is one of them, and if you see some of his work, you will start to see how the way I'm like using objects or different things to kind of mask the figure is also apparent in a lot of his work as well, where it's either like some things are fragmented with the identification of faces in his work, and you can kind of see that in a more abstract way how his work is impacting and influencing my work.
Cool. Excellent. Well, Taz, those are the questions that I have. I don't know if there's anything, any questions that you have or anything that you wanted to add before we wrap up.
No, if anybody else have other questions, I believe I'll be at the receptions for the show. So if people attend the reception, you can always ask me any other questions that people might have. So
that's a great point. Yeah, we're excited to have you. And I'll remind everyone watching this video, Tatsuki will have a solo show at ACW Lake-Nuveen from January 27th through March 11th of 2023. That show is Human Nature. He'll also be teaching 2 classes at ACW Lake-Nuveen, an oil landscape painting class and a painting with pulp class. So it's a paper making class. Taz, thank you so much for doing this interview, and thanks for everything that you've done for ACW Lake-Nuveen. We're super excited to have you.
yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, have a good one.
You too.